Before European settlement, this was the home of the Buandik and the Miantang people, and it was an area even then known to be very rich in resources. And that tradition of farming, of running livestock, is one that continued right up until before the vineyards started being established here on what had once been some of the major pastoral leases of the area. At the time the first vineyards were put in here, I was a journalist for the Stock Journal, which is a farming newspaper. And it's fair to say that the people that I was writing for thought they were crazy when they started planting vines in this part of the world. It had been very good cattle and sheep country, and also very good horse breeding country. And there was a lot of scepticism.
And there's great danger in being a pioneer, economic and it's a lot of hard work, and you don't have the backup of neighbours to assist you. You particularly in the wine industry, if you're developing a brand, it's very hard to come from nowhere. Although we did pretty well, because I think Decanter magazine voted us one of the 10 hot wineries in the world, I think, when we first got going, which was quite a bit of a coup.
We were involved in an established viticulture region, Coonawarra. We were looking for a bit of a change, and looking for, particularly this place, we chose consistency of soil. We had a good look around through other areas, and I've always had a bit of an interest in soil types in these maritime areas. It was
Not unknown as a viticulture area. There was one other established vineyard. The Wheel family had put a little vineyard in. It was growing pretty well. But also, it's a bit of a joke, but I used to be a livestock buyer, and you'd buy red lambs at Coonawarra and red lambs over here. So obviously the soil types were of some similarity. I mean, there's a lot of difference between Coonawarra and here, but there's Terra Rossa soil.
As young kids, I could always remember Dad, every time we came down here, we'd drive from Kingston through to Robe, and Dad would always say, this has got some of the best Terra Rossa soil around in plots as there are over in Coonawarra. And that was one of the major things that always stayed in the back of my brain, certainly when I got into the wine industry. My past was with Cellar Masters, so I was involved in setting up all this region down here. And one of our shareholders, major owners, wanted us to get into vineyards, purely because we couldn't access enough fruit out of Coonawarra. And there was a vineyard which came up for sale in Coonawarra, so Terry Davis, the MD at that stage, he and I went into Coonawarra to have a look at it, and Terry said, there's no way I'm going to pay all this money for this sort of stuff. There must be better material around, or better areas around, or same areas, which are very similar. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, there is back over yonder. We ended up paying $430 an acre here, which included all the improvements. So the basic land price was only about $250. So I got Colin Kidd on board very, very early on. So Colin was our viti consultant. Colin had actually planted some trial vineyards down around Cape Jaffa and over the back just over here. And
sometime in the 70s, wasn't it?
Yeah, but it was also just after he'd started looking at Padthaway. And he said to me was that he actually wanted to come over here, but the powers being, I think it was Philip Morris with Lindemans those days, said no, we'll go to Padthaway, because Seppelts had already done some planting over there, or were about to. So for a little boardroom shift, the Padthaway could have been Mount Benson Road. We went in initially with Chardonnay because obviously that was the earliest one we could get into production. And then Cabernet, I remember the first time we put the Cabernet in, went into I'm not sure if the Coonawarra Wine Show in those days was called Limestone Coast or just Coonawarra, but we ended up becoming a bit of a talking point there. So this would have been 95, I think, because the Black Wattle Cabernet walked away with a VHC, which is the equivalent of a gold medal. I thought when Chapudia came in here, I thought it was actually a tick of success for the region, because they could have gone anywhere else in Australia. I mean, they eventually also went into Heathcote, but the fact that they actually came in here and wanted to give this a go because they thought there was something in here gave all of us who at that stage a huge vote of confidence. Because, I mean, we've been doing this whole thing off our own back.
Their entree into the area started with the fact that they shared the same distributors as Cape Jaffa, and they were looking to invest in Australia. They came out here, They looked at the wines, they liked what they saw, they liked the soil. They saw that the soils were reasonably poor and not super fertile. Like the Rhone, in the Rhone is a good example of a place where the poorer soils make the most complex wines, and I think they saw the potential of here with the slightly sandy soils, the free draining limestone, as really good to establish vines in a condition that's not super easy. Working with an already established vineyard, they established an extra approximately 10 hectares of vines. And they also converted what was previously run as a conventionally managed vineyard over to biodynamics.
The sad thing about Chapudia is they've obviously shrunk their operations, certainly in Australia, so they pulled out of here a number of years ago.
Mount Benson's a little bit of an enigma in that it has a reputation for growing good crops, but it is hard country. I mean, you look at the trees, you look at the scrub. I read a wonderful quote from one of James Halliday's original books where he described Mount Benson as windblown, barren, and why would anyone want to go and plant grapes there? And my answer to that was, why wouldn't I? Wow, here's an opportunity to get away from a high vigour site where we can pick little niche areas and grow some really premium grapes naturally, so we don't have to physically retard them. You know, if you're thinking small scale enough, you can pick out little areas and spots and slopes and, you know, like they do in Burgundy. I think there's huge opportunities here for finding little niches and little microclimates that'll produce something pretty special that you wouldn't get in a more broad acre flat land like we have in further inland in South Australia.
We bought land down here in the 1950s, which is what my father did. The reason for that was that he worked in the CSIRO in Adelaide, and in the laboratories where they were working, a group of them were working on coast disease. The end result was that they found out that we were short of trace elements, copper and cobalt, and all that research work, or the field station work, was done at Robe. That was a really world significant piece of research, and the results went worldwide. It was very successful, and as a result of that, Father thought, oh well, we can solve the coast problem as far as stock's concerned. We'll buy a bit of land down here. So that's how we first bought the land. It was when Penfolds were looking for some additional land to establish a new vineyard that we contacted them, and the end result was that they bought 500 odd acres from us to establish their vineyard down here. And we thought, well, now's the opportunity. They'll give the district some sort of credibility. We'll develop a vineyard alongside them. They started planting in 1994, and we started in 95. We got some funny early comments. We said, oh, well, we'll establish a 100-acre vineyard, and they said, wait, hang on a minute. 100 acres is a pretty big vineyard. Why don't you just do 20 or 30? He said, you broadacre farmers don't understand this grape business. Mind you, we did understand it a little bit better when semi-trailer loads of posts arrived instead of 4 or 5, and 130 kilometres of drip tube, and all this sort of stuff started to bring it home to us.
I was involved with Quinn and Watson's Waterhouse Range originally, and selected a site, a really good site on the eastern side of Wokwine, and started from there. Got some good friends in Coonawarra, Bill Brand and Dale Lewis, who we took the cuttings from, and so we grew our own cuttings from Brand's Liara vineyard and also some from Dale's vineyard. The clones we used were Shiraz was 1654, Cabernet was CW44 and Ranella Selection. Grew our own cuttings out and then planted the cuttings in, obviously grew the whole thing right all the way through. We're growing some pretty good quality fruit. Some of our Shiraz went into St Honoré a couple of years ago, and so we're growing A and B grade fruit. We did plant some Pinot, which we pulled out in the end. Didn't like it, and I don't think it suits this area. And planted Chardonnay, which yeah, some pretty good Chardonnay comes out of this area. And mainly I think Shiraz and Cabernet are the two. Shiraz is especially really good growing some really good quality Shiraz. It's just the perfect drainage back in off the hillside, and it was yeah, we only ever had one frost in all the time that we had the vineyard, so beautiful site, great water, great location. So purchased the site subject to native vegetation clearance, and obviously with a contract with David Murdoch through back then was Southcorp.
Back in the early 1990s, then Southcorp were looking to do a massive expansion of vineyards. In the southeast South Australia, now called the Limestone Coast, we had significant holdings in Coonawarra, Padthaway and Bordertown, so we're looking for something for a little bit diverse and different. So we came down here. I looked pretty well from Bordertown to Kingston and down as far as Mount Gambier and Beachport. And this vineyard basically, well this site, because it's on the lee of the Wokwine Range, so it is a little bit protected from the southerly winds. Yeah, it took us about 18 months to find it. One of the things we do when we're looking for a potential site is look at the native vegetation and or anything that's actually been planted. If you look around, most of the trees around here are actually very stunted, which means in a viticultural sense it's going to be a devigorating site. And also it's interesting that the pines in Mount Benson region, they are some of the slowest growing in Australia. And by slow growing it means there's particularly high quality wood, and it's really interesting that the same can be extrapolated out of wine quality. If you've got a relatively lean site that neither advocates significant growth in natural vegetation or planted species, it means that this will be actually a slow growing, you know, for viticulture as well, high quality. We actually had a board meeting down here about the time we actually started developing the vineyard, and as he drove in, the chairman basically said, "What the f*** are we doing here?" But you know, it was interesting. Only 2 years later, after that sort of infamous comment, the vineyard in 1 year produced 707 Grange and Yattarna. It hasn't done that since, but it shows the potential of this vineyard. Realistically, our budgets back in there were about $50,000 per hectare, including land cost. And that was a capitalisation over 5 years. So that's what the investment was back there. It was a big gamble, really. You know, when you think about doing a vineyard development of this magnitude in an area that's really semi-proven, I suppose, historically, because there hasn't been a lot of history associated with these regions, it was arguably a corporate gamble, but a corporate gamble that actually paid off tenfold. With regard to rootstock versus own roots, it's predominantly on rootstock, and that was, you know, sandy soils tend to have a degree of nematodes in them. So we were trying to, I suppose, ensure against any downward trends by actually putting on rootstock. This was planted as a Penfolds vineyard, so right from the word go it was actually associated with the Penfolds products. It's been interesting over the time, but it's basically pretty well a backbone of Saint Henri now, and has produced some exceptional Cabernets, 407, 707, and it's producing really good Pinot as well. So it is specifically targeted at the Penfolds portfolio. You've got this really fine wines being sold throughout the world at significant prices, and the Robe is credited on those labels for producing that style of wine.
We followed basically what Penfolds were doing, and it was Shiraz, Cabernet in the first year, and some Merlot, and the second year of planting was more of the same, Shiraz, Cabernet, Merlot and Chardonnay. But I think it was handling the land was different. I mean, for argument's sake, you know, the initial stage was ripping the countryside. Now, we'd spent a lot of time rolling rocks into the ground, if you know what I mean. All of a sudden, we were ripping them all up in these great long rows. Our tractors wouldn't fit down 2.5 metre rows, so we established 3 metre rows. In effect, it probably wasted a bit of land, but we had the land. And it probably gives you a little bit better ventilation and things of that nature. I mean, it's a small thing, but it may be significant at certain times. In the early days, we ran our own sort of work gangs, and that was a mixture of people that a lot of that work was wintertime work, so fishermen could do that job, and young people that was their first job. Penfolds supplied cuttings to us. The percentage that grew was probably about 99%, you know, everything seemed to grow. Shiraz and Cabernet are both run into A-grade fruit, and it can vary. One year it would be Shiraz, and next year it would be Cabernet, I think. But I put it this way, I'd be quite happy if the whole vineyard was just growing Shiraz at the present time.
I thought because of the more moderate climate and that we'd have better ripening conditions, and so I philosophically leant more towards Shiraz. I went with Viognier as a sister grape to Shiraz to balance the portfolio. But I think our sleeping variety here is Merlot, and we make great Merlots here, and there's some little quirk of climate and soil, we can really get Merlot right here. That we can get berry flavour in it, almost Cabernet-like. We get strength in it of tannin, probably stronger wines than we can make with Cabernet.
Due to our climate and soil type here, the sandier soils tend to give, if you listen to the French, better aromatics and I guess you know, more minerality in wines, softer tannins. For me, I love Cabernet out of this district. I think we grow fantastic Cabernet. I would never say in a room of Coonawarra people, but I think it's pretty consistent from year to year. But we sort of also specialise, I think, in Shiraz. We're trying to make rain like Shiraz's, cool climate, softer style. We started in 97 or 98, I guess, the dabbling with organic and BD viticulture, but I guess we've sort of taken, it took us probably, you know, a good 10 years to get confident with the whole process before we started the certification. There's definitely better quality fruit. There's less of it, obviously, which may or may not make a terribly economic good rationale, but certainly quality, thicker skins, better flavours, nicer tannins, I don't know, and healthy.
I'm John Good, and I'm a fourth generation farmer or landholder in this area, and Anita, who's sitting beside me, is the fifth, and yeah, we've descendants of the river trade, the River Murray trade, and my ancestors came down here in the 1880s and set up stores and ventured into land, so we've been here ever since. And just recently we've ventured into viticulture back in about year 2000. I'd made up our mind in the early 1990s after we started seeing some of the initial Cabernets and so on coming off and coming through here. And it took us quite a few years before we actually planted because I divested of some land. Well, certainly the major buyer of the land from me was the Kreglinger Group, which are based in Belgium, and by memory I think they're the second oldest business name in the world, and the current people running the business, their family has only been running it for something just over 200 years at the moment. And they certainly brought in and have done a wonderful job and really developed what I was glad to see, and that was a lot of employment for local people and you know, gave us that bit of critical mass. We had to make use of the land that we had and try and grow some good fruit. And what has developed from that is that in our own particular vineyard, it's not the reds that are the really good doers, it's the simple ones of the white varieties, the Semillons, the Pinot Gris and the Sauvignon Blanc.
I would like to see a lot of more white varieties. Everybody who ever talks to me knows that I'm a bit of a white variety freak, and I'm fine with it, and I will always say that Mount Benson is good for aromatic whites. I guess we rely more on the knowledge that we know and the knowledge that we have from how seasons run year in, year out, how this season, you know, talking to Dad and saying, how does this season compare to what you know in the past, and is this like this year, or, you know, and being able to, I guess, preempt what you think might happen judged on your knowledge of 45 years of farming in the area. And that's a strong bonus for us to be able to look at a season and have a vague idea of how it can turn.
We know what Black Wattle has done here. We know what some of the other producers have done around here. I think it's still in the making, and I think there's this great adage in the wine industry, anywhere you go in the world, is that the older your vines get, the better your fruit quality is actually going to be, provided they're looked after properly.
Vine age has made a massive difference. I think, like any young vineyard, you get a bit of variation in those first probably 10 to 12 years. Now we're sort of hitting 20 years on average for all the material we're bringing in from here and also from other vineyards in the Limestone Coast we've been working with for a long time. We're seeing good consistency and I guess, pretty solid wines.